Welcome to tonight's program. I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Director of Programs here at the American Civil War Museum. Got my background up, the beautiful lobby at our Tredegar site here in Richmond. We also operate the historic White House of the Confederacy, as well as a museum out in Appomattox. So welcome everyone. It's great to see people starting to use the chat and see where everyone is joining us from tonight. Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Bethesda, Maryland, Springfield, Virginia, Middlesex, New Jersey. Welcome everyone. I'm going to get us started, and I do have some announcents about the programs that we have coming up at the museum at our various locations. And I'll mention that on April 25th, we'll have Dr. David Blight speaking on Frederick Douglass, but that program is sold out. So our Richmond program for the month is sold out, but it's not too late if you want to catch the last of our spring lectures, part of our Remaking America series. On May 30th, we'll have Dr. Barton Myers, who will be talking about Winfield Scott, someone who really doesn't get a lot of press. So I'm excited to hear more about General Winfield Scott. And then in Appomattox, our in-person program for the month of May will be on May 9th. And the timing on this one's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be at 6 p.m. instead of 6:30. And we will have Patrick O'Donnell with us speaking on his book, The Unvanquished, The Untold Story of Lincoln's Special Forces, the Manhunt for Mosby's Rangers, and the Shadow War that forged America's Special Operations. So this is like a fascinating topic, and this will be an in-person talk out in Appomattox. And then our virtual book talk for May is going to be on April 16th, and it will feature Jim Downs, Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine. So mark your calendars for that virtual program on May 16th. And that will be at 6:30. And then one other announcement, here at our Tredegar location, we have a new exhibit that'll be opening. It's called The Impending Crisis. And if you're familiar with our museum, the main gallery takes you through the entire war from start to finish. The Impending Crisis will be a look at the coming of war. So it'll be a great complement to our main exhibit. So if you're in the Richmond area, do come by and check out our new exhibit that will open on the weekend of April 27th. And now for tonight's guest author, I am very pleased to introduce John L. Hopkins. He's a communication and public relations professional with more than 3 decades of experience in strategic communication planning, issues management, media relations, crisis communication, news and feature writing, and team building in higher education, nonprofit, and agency settings. He was born and raised in New York City, earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Williams College, and was transplanted to the Midwest in the mid-1990s. And John and his wife have 3 grown daughters. And this is his first book. So we're pleased to welcome John Hopkins to talk about The World Will Never See the Like, the Gettysburg Reunion of 1913. So with that, I am going to turn the screen over to our guest author.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And I am going to get my PowerPoint open here. And go to the full screen. There we go. So far, so good. And I've succeeded in unmuting, so I think I'm good to go. Um, well, thank you all for joining me tonight, and your interest in hearing a little bit about this book. It is my first book after a checkered career in public relations and communications. And so, without any further ado, I'm just gonna launch into it. Make sure I can advance. Yep, good. Okay, all systems go. On an early spring day in 1908, Henry Shippen Heidekoper, a veteran of the 150th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry who had lost his right arm at Gettysburg, met with Pennsylvania Governor Edwin Stewart at the Union League in Philadelphia. He said he had given much thought to the fact that in July 1913, it would be 50 years since the Battle of Gettysburg, and he urged that the anniversary be properly celebrated. Governor Stewart agreed, and the following year, the Pennsylvania legislature authorized the creation of the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg Commission. More than 2.75 million men served in the armed forces of the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War. 2 million survived to return home, and in the decades that followed, they played an outsized role in the life of the nation. 5 of the 7 US presidents between 1869 and 1901 were Union combat veterans. In 1892, fully half the United States Senate and 4 out of every 10 members of the House were Union or Confederate veterans. Pensions for Union veterans in that year accounted for 43% of the entire federal budget. But as the 20th century began, the veterans' ranks were thinning, and their influence was beginning to wane. Membership in the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest organization of Union veterans, had fallen by almost a third from its peak. And in 1903, the year of the Wright brothers' first flight, the Philadelphia Public Ledger declared that the days of the Civil War, quote, seem infinitely remote, as though they must have belonged to some elementary period of civilization with which we no longer have anything in common. The old soldiers themselves were keenly aware of the passage of time. The 50th anniversary of those 3 bloody days in July 1863 would be an opportunity to remind their fellow citizens that the unity and prosperity that the nation now enjoyed had its roots in the hallowed ground of 100 Civil War battlefields, of which none loomed larger than Gettysburg. One of the Pennsylvania Commission's first acts was to write to the governors of every US state, commonwealth, and territory, inviting their participation in the event. Ultimately, all appointed representatives to work with the commission, including Union veterans Joshua Chamberlain from Maine. You can see in the front row here, about the middle of the front row with a little number 9 on his shoulder. Elijah Hunt Rhodes from Rhode Island, who's in the back row, number 41. And Dan Sickles of New York, as well as Confederates Evander N. Law of Florida and S.A. Cunningham, the editor of Confederate Veteran Magazine, who was representing Tennessee. To chair the commission, Governor Stewart appointed a former national commander-in-chief of the GAR, 72-year-old Brevet Brigadier General Louis Wagner of Philadelphia. At their first general conference in October 1910, the commission decided that the celebration of the 50th anniversary would be held from July 1st through July 4th. And Dan Sickles, at that first meeting, proposed that, quote, a permanent peace monument of some kind should be dedicated on the field at the time of the Jubilee celebration. He also declared that he would like to see the veterans of both sides meet at Gettysburg, which, he said, would make the occasion historical, a national love feast. All the other veterans warmly endorsed Sickles' sentiments and declared the Peace Memorial by far the most important part of the proposed celebration. And they looked confidently to Congress to underwrite the $300,000 cost of the reunion camp itself, plus another $500,000 for the Peace Memorial, while the state of Pennsylvania would chip in $250,000 toward transportation accommodation for VIPs, and various local costs. The Pennsylvania legislature passed its appropriation in June 1911, and then not much of anything happened. Months passed, in fact, and General Wagner, the commission's chairman, seemed singularly lacking in any sense of urgency. In fact, it was not until May 1912, a year and a half after the first General Conference, and barely 14 months until the reunion was set to take place, that the old general even had his first meeting with representatives of the two railroads that served Gettysburg. Nor had the commission begun to plan for the water supply, sanitation, medical facilities, and other infrastructure that would be required to accommodate tens of thousands of men in their 70s and 80s. And Congress had appropriated just $150,000 toward the $300,000 expense of the camp, and not a dime for the Peace Memorial. The veterans, needless to say, were bitterly disappointed, while the people of Gettysburg were increasingly worried by what seemed to them a fast approaching train wreck. General Wagner's do-nothing policy, wrote the editor of the Gettysburg Compiler, was leading to a necessary day of reckoning ahead. The governor of Pennsylvania was fast coming to the same conclusion, and in late January 1913, when Wagner revealed that he had not yet invited President-elect Woodrow Wilson or any of the other dignitaries the commission was counting on to attend, and that none of the speakers or the other major elements of the four-day program had been finalized, the governor asked for and received the old general's resignation. In his place, he appointed James M. Schoonmaker, a Union cavalry veteran, successful businessman, and one of Pittsburgh's wealthiest men, who now had barely 5 months to make up for 2 years of dithering. It was, as you can imagine, a mad dash to the finish line. The commission had decided that the reunion camp would open on Sunday, June 29th, and close the following Sunday, in the hopes of staggering the arrival and departure times of the tens of thousands of veterans expected to attend. By the first week in April 1913, 200 laborers were hard at work, laying water mains from newly dug wells, framing up scores of temporary structures from camp kitchens to field hospitals, and building hundreds of long wooden tables and benches at which the veterans would eat. They finished erecting the last tent just hours before the old men began to arrive. The reunion camp covered 280 acres from Confederate Avenue on the west, at the top of this diagram, to the Emmitsburg Road on the east, and from South Street in the town of Gettysburg to a point just north of the high watermark monument. More than 6,500 tents were laid out along 47 miles of company streets, illuminated by 500 electric lights. There were 173 field kitchens, 2 full field hospitals, 11 aid stations, a temporary post office, and a 13,000-seat tent, where the main events, along with dozens of state and individual unit reunions, would take place. And in a rail car on one of the new sidings in town were 100 coffins. The Army doctors anticipated that the veterans' advanced age, combined with the heat and the long distances many would travel, would exact a steep toll. Now, overseeing the entire encampment was Brigadier General Hunter Liggett of the U.S. Army, and the 1,465 officers and men under his command included Lieutenant Simon Bolivar Buckner, son of the Confederate general of the same name, who served as liaison to the scores of newspaper reporters and photographers who had been accredited to cover the event. While the cavalry detachment assigned to patrol the battlefield park's roads included another young lieutenant named George S. Patton, Jr., whose great uncle had been mortally wounded in Pickett's charge. As you can imagine, the logistics of transporting more than 53,000 veterans to Gettysburg, some 45,000 Union men and about 8,000 Confederates, were daunting. Special trains departed from Detroit and Minneapolis, Richmond and Charlottesville, Portland, Oregon, and Portland, Maine, where Joshua Chamberlain saw his old comrades off and then, under strict doctor's orders that it would be extremely hazardous to his health to accompany them, reluctantly returned home. By nightfall on Sunday, June 29th, 21,000 veterans were in camp. At around 2 a.m., they were awakened by a pair of loud explosions, and the air was split by the unmistakable rebel yell out near Seminary Ridge, where most of the old Confederates were quartered. It seems that some of the livelier ones had swabbed out two of the old cannons that marked the position of Edward Porter Alexander's batteries, charged them with black powder, and then set them off. It was clearly going to be quite a week. Between midnight Sunday and midnight Monday, 53 trains deposited another 22,000 veterans in camp, and the strain of funneling that much traffic down to Gettysburg's two rail lines was beginning to show. The South Carolina special was 6 hours late. New Jersey veterans reached camp long after midnight to find their tents occupied by others, so they bedded down in the Ohio section, much to the dismay of the Buckeyes, who finally rolled in around 6:30 a.m. But it all got sorted out, and the veterans were soon able to turn their attention to more important matters, which a reporter for the New York Times described as the hunting up of the man who shot you if you could find him, and if you couldn't, then the hunting up of the man whose regiment fought yours. There was, the reporter said, an amazing number of such reunions. John Morris, for example, was a veteran of the 1st Ohio Light Artillery. On July 2nd, 1863, the 19-year-old and his battery mates fought their guns near the base of Little Round Top on either side of the Wheatfield Road. When they returned in 1913, they met a Georgia veteran who had charged their position repeatedly. I told him I was glad to meet him, Morris said, and that I thought they did some pretty good charging. To which the Georgian replied, yes, and we all thought you did some pretty good shooting, and we tried to give you your money's worth. Another Georgian, Harry Simmons, who had been wounded in fierce fighting around the 4th New York Battery near Devil's Den on July 2nd, was reunited with Hugh Martin, a member of one of the gun crews who had helped carry him from the field after he was hit. We simply could not be separated at the reunion, Simmons told a reporter, and were together much of the time at Gettysburg. Some veterans, like 82-year-old Confederate Colonel Thomas Taylor Munford and 76-year-old Captain George N. Bliss of the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, arranged in advance to meet at the reunion and ended up talking for hours together. But many more met serendipitously. A Virginian who had lived in Missouri since the close of the war found a tent full of his old comrades from Company A of the 11th Virginia. It's sure a treat for sore eyes, he said. I never expected to see any of you boys again. A Union veteran from Harrisburg was reunited with 3 fellow members of the 81st Pennsylvania, whom he had not seen since the Grand Review in Washington in May 1865. And on his long train ride north from Canton, Mississippi, J.C. Pitchford, a veteran of the Madison Artillery and Pogues Battalion, suddenly heard his name called by an old comrade, Lon Bailey. There was a hearty hand grasp, Pitchford wrote after the reunion, but no room for words. I had not seen or heard of him since I left him sorely wounded on the battlefield on April 2nd, 1865. Now, back when the reunion was being planned, there had been considerable discussion of whether Confederate veterans would be permitted to wear their United Confederate veteran uniforms, like the gentleman on the left in this photo, and to carry their old battle flags. Former Confederate General Felix H. Robertson of Texas thought that if Union veterans were permitted to wear their GAR uniforms, the same courtesy should be extended to those who wore the gray. Others disagreed, including Elijah Rhodes, who thought it all should go to the encampment solely as American citizens. Robertson was equally adamant on the question of battle flags. At the Pennsylvania Commission's Third General Conference in January 1913, he declared, "I want to wave in your faces again the very Texas Brigade battle flag that we shook in your faces on July 3rd, 1863. If you were able to drive it back then, its faded colors can do you no harm now." Pennsylvania Governor John Tenner settled the matter by declaring that the old rebels were coming as guests of the state of Pennsylvania, and it made no difference to him whether they came in civilian attire or in their UCV uniforms, or whether they carried their old battle flags. And so, when the reunion opened, on the Confederate side of camp, the old flags were displayed with pride. You can see here a couple in a part of the South Carolina area of the encampment. With pride, but not entirely without controversy. According to Vermont veteran Frank Kenfield, many of the boys took exception to the Confederate flag and considered it an insult to that emblem of liberty for which they fought 4 long years to sustain. Now, as far as controversy is concerned, arguably the 2 most controversial figures connected to the Battle of Gettysburg were Major General Daniel E. Sickles of the Army of the Potomac and Lieutenant General James Longstreet of the Army of Northern Virginia. Sickles, for moving his 3rd Corps without authorization some 1,500 yards forward of the rest of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, where it was shattered by the Confederate attack on the battle's 2nd day. Longstreet, for his alleged tardiness in launching that attack, and his well-documented lack of enthusiasm for Pickett's charge the following day. But also, perhaps above all, because lost cause partisans like Jubal Early, after the war, needed a scapegoat to deflect any hint of blame for Gettysburg's outcome from the sainted Robert E. Lee. By 1913, Longstreet was 9 years in his grave, but his widow, Helen Dortch Longstreet, pictured with him here a few years earlier, a former newspaper reporter and fierce defender of her late husband's legacy. Well, Helen was very much alive and came to Gettysburg, where she filed stories that were syndicated in newspapers around the country, as did the 92-year-old Sickles, still eager to explain to anyone who would listen the indispensable role he claimed to have played in the Union victory. Sickles began his July 2nd newspaper dispatch with characteristic modesty. "The thronging hordes who have motored and walked and trolleyed to my camp today have swept their hats off and hailed it as Sickles Day," he wrote. "And so I have always regarded July 2nd. It was upon this day in '63 that I lost my leg and did my little part by the mercy of God to preserve the Union. If I had not taken the initiative, our left would have been lost. Longstreet said I won the battle by my advance move." In her column that day, Mrs. Longstreet backed him up. It was his victory, she told her readers. Now, as for her late husband, she declared that, quote, "all the fighting worthy of the name for the Southern cause at Gettysburg on July 2nd and 3rd was made by Longstreet, the hardest fighter in the Confederate service. He was easily the superior of Lee as an offensive tactician." Mrs. Longstreet clearly not vying to win any more friends among the veterans, at least south of the Mason-Dixon line, than her late husband had had. Now that evening, around 7 p.m., 2 Virginians in their mid-30s who had accompanied their veteran fathers to the reunion were drinking in the packed dining room of the Gettysburg Hotel and listening to a Union veteran across the table holding forth on the beauty of the character of Abraham Lincoln. One of the young Virginians, W.B. Henry, leaned across the table and described the martyred president in vile terms having to do with his affection for African Americans. The Union veteran picked up a heavy glass tumbler and threw it at Henry, who leaped up and pulled a knife. As women screamed and other diners scrambled to get out of the way, 2 waiters and a bellhop were stabbed as they attempted to subdue Henry. He made it as far as the sidewalk, slashing several others along the way, where state troopers finally wrestled him to the ground and placed him under arrest. Now, Gettysburg's saloons, which normally closed at midnight, had been running around the clock since the reunion opened. But the headlines the next morning were not the sort to encourage post-reunion tourism, and the town fathers ordered all barrooms to close at 11 p.m. for the remainder of the week. Now, if July 2nd had been Sickles' Day, at least in Dan Sickles' mind, there was no question that July 3rd was going to be Pickett Day. Even though nearly as many North Carolina regiments took part in the third day's assault on the Union Center as those from Virginia, 15 and 18 respectively, along with a dozen more from Alabama, Tennessee, and Florida, for the average American in 1913, Pickett's charge was all about those Virginians. These were the men, the Philadelphia Inquirer declared, whose memories hold more of the tragedy of the battle than any other soldier. Fewer than 100 survivors of Pickett's division attended the reunion, but they were, according to a Union veteran, the Confederates most sought after in the camp. Readily identifiable by their white silk badges, 6 inches long by 2.5 wide, which bore the words Pickett's Men, 1863, 1913, Sic Semper Tyrannis, July 3rd, Gettysburg. The reunion's organizers had designated 2 p.m. on July 3rd as the moment when Pickett's charge would be reenacted. Although in deference to the veterans' age and the blistering heat, temperatures hovered in the 90s and topped 100 more than once during the course of the reunion. The Virginians formed up on the Emmitsburg Road rather than cover the whole distance over which they had advanced 50 years earlier. Waiting for them on Cemetery Ridge were almost 200 veterans of the Philadelphia Brigade, each of whom had 2 small souvenir badges, courtesy of Wanamaker's department store, one to keep and one to pin on an old adversary. Now, this is the iconic photo from the 1913 reunion that you've undoubtedly seen. But the actual scene that day was a bit different. As a band from Richmond played Dixie, the old men stepped off behind a shot-riddled Confederate battle flag through fields of knee-high wheat and timothy grass. Some walked with the aid of canes, others shaded themselves with umbrellas. And when they neared the wall, they had to elbow their way through a dense crowd of spectators and reporters. And then listen patiently to Congressman J. Hampton Moore of Philadelphia, who the New York Tribune noted spoke at some length while the merciless sun fairly roasted his audience. Finally, the speech is over. The 2 lines surged forward to shake hands across the wall, but the crowds made it impossible to frame the money shot that the photographers so desperately wanted. So this one had to be staged. July 3rd was capped off with a fireworks display that reportedly cost $10,000. And when it was over, the veterans settled down outside their tents. Yanks and Rebs mingled together everywhere. The air had finally cooled down, and according to the Detroit Free Press's man in camp, no one wanted to go to bed. The next morning, July 4th, at 5 a.m., a U.S. Army band struck up an Independence Day medley of America, Yankee Doodle, Marching Through Georgia, and Dixie, as they marched through the streets of the camp, rousing the veterans from their beds, who responded with cheers. The men of the Irish Brigade began the day on a more solemn note at St. Francis Xavier Church in town, where a Requiem High Mass was celebrated for the repose of the souls of their deceased comrades. Around 11 a.m., President Woodrow Wilson arrived in town by special train at the Western Maryland station. and was whisked by automobile to the big tent. After a brief photo op with a couple of veterans, he mounted the stage and began to speak, but not about the battle or the reunion or even the veterans. "I need not tell you," Wilson said, "how the battle went, how it ended, what it signified. Instead, he pressed upon his audience of veterans and reporters his vision of present-day America and the progress it could achieve if only it united behind a strong, wise, energetic leader, a leader like, well, Woodrow Wilson." According to the New York Times, Wilson was interrupted only once or twice with cheering that seemed perfunctory. And then he headed back to his private rail car after spending precisely 46 minutes in Gettysburg. Jacob Kress, who had grown up in town and served in the 138th Pennsylvania, judged the speech a very poor thing. At noon, as the president's train rolled out of town, a bugle rang out, and a 48-gun salute began to boom. Veterans stopped what they were doing, uncovered their heads, and for 5 minutes the whole camp fell silent in a final tribute to the dead. Many wept. After lunch, many began preparing to leave, and by evening the Army officers estimated that 10 to 15,000 veterans remained in camp. Sunday morning, the exodus continued. H. Hodges went out to the angle just after daybreak and filled a suitcase with soil that he planned to spread in his front yard back home in Union Hill, North Carolina. But as he waited at the Western Maryland Railroad station in the 90-degree heat, Hodges suddenly clutched his chest and fell dead, the 9th and final veteran to die at the reunion. A toll, however, far smaller than the organizers had feared. Western Maryland officials promised to send the soil south with his remains so that it could be placed in his grave. For the men on both sides, the reunion had been an event unlike anything they had ever experienced, and its impact was profound. "There never has been, nor there never will be, any such gathering of men again," wrote North Carolina veteran A.H. Boyden to his new friend Robert Drummond in New York. "It has cemented and absolutely blotted out whatever little hatred might have remained in the hearts of the men who wore the gray." A Union veteran wrote to an old Confederate, "It has permanently altered my point of view and forever changed my thinking. I tell all my friends that you men are first-class Americans." Newspapers across the country deemed the reunion an unqualified success. "As a moral spectacle," declared the Christian Science Monitor, "the analog of the event cannot be cited from ancient, medieval, or modern history." The secret to that success, said a former commander of the United Confederate Veterans, was simple. Everyone simply ignored the differences which led to the war. Indeed, speaker after speaker at the reunion, from both North and South, had offered up central elements of the lost cause myth: that each side had simply fought for the right as they understood it, that the South had taken up arms to defend states' rights, not slavery. Emancipation was referred to obliquely, if at all, as an outcome of the war. The emphasis was overwhelmingly on the restoration of the Union. And the war was framed as a titanic clash of men of common Anglo-Saxon heritage and blood. Now, nowhere in this lovingly constructed Civil War memory was there a place for the more than 180,000 African Americans who also had fought to restore the Union and to liberate nearly 4 million of their enslaved brethren. You would never know it from the contemporary press coverage or the 270-page report of the Pennsylvania Commission, but there were veterans of the United States colored troops at the 1913 reunion. 50 came from Thomas Hamilton Post 56 of the GAR in Trenton, New Jersey. A dozen from David R. Stevens Post 520 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And still others from New York City's Thaddeus Stevens Post number 255. In my research for this book, I was able to identify 16 of these veterans by name, including Henry Charles of the 55th Massachusetts, Alfred Williams of the 29th Connecticut, and Cassius Mars of the 41st U.S. Colored Infantry. Black veterans appear in just 2 of the hundreds of photos preserved in the state archives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And you have to look very carefully to find them. Here's a crowd of Pennsylvania veterans arriving in their section of the camp. On the far left of the frame, an African-American veteran looks toward the camera. On the right, another, wearing a bowler hat, stands with his back to the photographer. It's a little bit easier to see them here. Only a little bit. I said it was hard to find them. Now here's another wide shot of a group of veterans around the Pennsylvania Memorial, including, if you zoom in, these 2 gentlemen sitting on the steps. Needless to say, any USCT veterans are absent from the photos that ran in the newspaper coverage. The veterans who went back to Gettysburg in 1913 hoped that the good feelings and positive press generated by the reunion would help revive their dream of a peace monument. In September, the Gettysburg Peace Memorial Association was formally launched with Joshua Chamberlain and Evander Law as honorary presidents. The group set about lobbying members of Congress, and by the summer of 1914, they were cautiously optimistic about their prospects. But the outbreak of war in Europe dashed those hopes. Their chief congressional ally told them that no appropriation would be forthcoming. It would take another quarter century for the peace monument to be built. None of the organizers of the Gettysburg Peace Memorial Association would live to see it dedicated. I'd like to close with these 2 men who, for me, exemplify the spirit of the 1913 reunion. On the left is Union veteran Frank H. Cobb of the 1st Regiment of Berdan's Sharpshooters. On the right, William H. Sanders of the 11th Alabama. They met for the first time while on picket duty along the Rappahannock River in 1863, where they swapped tobacco for sugar and coffee. A year later, when Cobb was seriously wounded and captured in the wilderness, their paths crossed again, as Sanders, the 11th Alabama's regimental surgeon, saw to the Yanks' treatment. After the war, Sanders set up a medical practice in Mobile. Cobb went home to Hudson, Michigan, where he worked as a railroad clerk. They corresponded for a time after the war, but eventually fell out of touch. And then in March 1913, Sanders wrote to the postmaster in Hudson, seeking to find out if Cobb was still alive. He was. And they resumed their correspondence and made plans to meet at the reunion, where they spent 2 days together walking over the battlefield. When the reunion in Gettysburg was over, Sanders traveled back to Hudson as Cobb's highly honored guest, according to the local paper, and 200 townspeople turned out for a reception in his honor. The veterans, like Cobb and Sanders, were sure that this gathering of 53,000 old comrades and former foes would be remembered for as long as the Battle of Gettysburg itself. But it was not to be. As the old soldiers faded away, so too did the public's memory of the 1913 reunion. I hope you'll agree that it deserves to be reclaimed from history's footnotes. I'd like to thank you for your attention. There's a great deal more, obviously, to this story than I can cover in 30 minutes, but I hope I've at least piqued your interest. If I have, the world will see the light. The Gettysburg Reunion of 1913 is available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook formats from SavisBeatty.com, except at the moment, it's not available in hardcover because they've run through the first printing. Talk about a problem you like to have. And the books that the museum had ordered have already sold out. So normally you'd be offered a chance to purchase one directly from the American Civil War Museum, but they don't have any on hand, and neither does Savas Beatty at this point. However, if I've so piqued your interest that you can't possibly wait until there are more copies available in probably late May, early June, for anyone who's really dying to get their hands on one, I would be more than happy to actually sell you not just a copy, but a signed copy. It's the cover price is $32.95. I will I'll cover the shipping myself. I'll, put any sort of message in it you want. All you need to do is just email me after the program at some point at john.lee.hopkins@gmail.com. Much to the delight of my 3 daughters, I finally am set up on Venmo and Zelle, but good old-fashioned check and cash is also equally acceptable and equally workable. So with that, I will stop talking for the moment and turn it back over to Kelly, who will moderate any questions you might have. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. I love talking about this, and I'm so glad that you joined us this evening to hear a little bit about this reunion.
Thank you, John. That was excellent. So much good information there. And I did see some questions come in. So let me see what we've got. And hopefully, if others have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. Niels asked, did Sickles and other GAR leaders collectively agree to exclude Black Union veterans from the reunion?
I have found no evidence of that. No, there's a glancing reference in the minutes of the Planning Commission that at one of the meetings, a question came up from some of the Southern members as to whether Black veterans would be at the reunion, and there's no indication of how that question was answered.
Huh.
But no, there's no indication that that on the Union side, at least, there were anything other than welcoming and encouraging for African American veterans to attend. How many in total attended? Hard to say. Like I said, I was able to identify a relative handful by name. Attendance, I think, would have been held, African American veteran attendance probably would have been held down by a couple of things. First, to be blunt, there were just fewer African American veterans still alive in 1913. The ravages of time and ill health and relative poverty for many of them meant that there were just fewer of them around. There were no USCT regiments engaged at Gettysburg, so there was not would not have been that personal connection to the battle. And the rigors, both physical and financial, of getting there from farther afield would have been fairly daunting. So I think it's not surprising that the ones I have come across, either by name or by reference in newspaper coverage to men from this post coming, are all pretty much from Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey.
That makes sense. Did you find any, this is kind of a follow-up to that, did you find any critique of the Gettysburg reunion for the lost cause elements in African American newspapers or anything along those lines?
No, Barbara Gannon, who wrote a great book on the relationship between Black and white GAR members in the years after the war, looked into that and found almost no mention in caveat in the surviving Black press. So I mean, there was lots and lots of Black newspapers, Black owned, Black focused newspapers at that time. Fewer of them have survived and made it into archives or made it into a resource like newspapers.com. But yeah, she found, and actually, if you'll bear with me for a moment, I think I can grab her book off the shelf here. So yeah, the book is called The One Cause,
Mm-hmm.
Black and White Comradeship in the Grand Army of the Republic by Barbara Gannon. And yeah, sorry, here. According to the Black-owned New York Age, for example, quoting from her book, when former Southern soldiers reenacted their famous war cry at Gettysburg, quote, the Negro veterans there looked on in silence and listened to the rebel yell without responding to it, unquote. The Cleveland Gazette, an African-American newspaper, similarly reported that, quote, the Negro veterans and many white JR veterans there looked on in silence and listened to the rebel yell without responding to it. But those were, I think, those were the only two examples of mentions of the reunion in the African-American press at the time. So there may have been more, but it has not survived through the years.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
And Angela wants to know, she says, on reflection, was the reunion a seed or one of the first flowers of the lost cause, especially since by the Battle of Gettysburg, the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed?
The lost cause was certainly well up and rolling before 1913. So no, I would say it was a manifestation of it, if anything, and a manifestation of the degree to which those themes had really penetrated into, the national consciousness. It was by no means just Southern veterans and people from states of the former Confederacy who were speaking at the reunion who rolled those themes into their remarks. You found it, to greater or lesser degrees in the remarks of certainly Northern politicians who were there. Less so certainly in the commentary of the veterans themselves, the Northern veterans themselves. And, I've found some references to, Northern veterans who, in their personal accounts of being at the reunion, commented somewhat sharply on the fact that the former Confederates were laying it on pretty thick in terms of their selective remembering of history.
People are very much buying into that reconciliationist kind of mindset. So someone says, nicely done.
Thank you.
Curious, how long did it take you to write the book, or approximately numbers of hours of research?
Boy, hard to say, because this started out as kind of a nights and weekends project. So I first got interested in this from reading another book, from reading Pickett's Charge in History and Memory by Carol Reardon, which is a terrific book, very well written and very interesting, about not just about, it opens being about Pickett's Charge, but the bulk of the book is about how Pickett's Charge was remembered and remembered differently, and how varying interpretations of it were argued over by the veterans themselves as the years went on. And in that book, there's 7 or 8 pages about the 1913 reunion. And I read those pages, I don't know, 15 years ago, and thought, wow, that's fascinating. 53,000 of these old guys under tents in the heat in 1913. Let me go find the book that someone's undoubtedly written about this, because, this certainly must deserve a book-length treatment. And at that time, I found that no one had. So I started doing research in probably in 2013, and I was still gainfully employed at that time. So this was a nights and weekends project for several years. By the time I retired in the summer of 2019, I had a manuscript done and started shopping it around. Coincidentally, in summer of 2019, Thomas Flagle's book about the 1913 reunion appeared. And any author will know the sinking feel. I mean, you have this nagging feeling in the back of your head the whole time you're working on a project, particularly one that takes, a number of years. Is someone else working away on the same topic? And it turned out someone was, although he takes a different approach and different angle, and focuses very tightly on 4 individual veterans, 2 Northerners, 2 Southerners, and their personal histories and their experiences at the reunion and their perceptions and so forth. And it's very much about, so he's got a very sort of tight focus. whereas I tried to look at sort of the whole sweep of the story, from the planning to the, the event itself and how it was interpreted. So I haven't actually answered that question. So I started doing research sometime in 2013, and I had a manuscript by summer 2019, but that was, like I say, working nights and weekends on it. So I have no idea how many hours. A lot.
Many, many, many hours.
But they were enjoyable hours.
And speaking kind of about the book, and what's the inspiration for the title, The World Will Never See the Like?
I'm prepared for this one this time, because that was a question that came up that I should have anticipated the first time I was doing one of these with like a Civil War roundtable. And I was frantically scrambling through my book to try to find where that quote was. It's a quote, J. Thompson Brown, who was a member of the R.E. Lee Camp #1 of the United Confederate Veterans in Richmond, actually, said, "The world has not and never will see the like." That was part of his commentary on the event.
That's a great title, and the immensity of it, to think about 50. Did you say 53,000?
53,000, yeah.
That's just incredible.
And almost all of them in their 70s and early 80s. There was one guy there who was, depending on, they're a little vague on his actual birth date, he was 101, 102. Guy who had been a Teamster, a Union Teamster.
And Lyndon wants to know, what happened to the man who stabbed all the people?
Also a good question. So W.B. Henry, who was the son of a Confederate veteran, he came to trial in November, and he pleaded guilty. And his attorney, who happened to be the son of one of the three judge panel that was hearing the case, so the son asked for a suspended sentence, and it was supported by written petitions from several of those whom he had stabbed, to whom Henry apparently paid a total of $1,500 in financial compensation, in civil damages, as well as letters from Virginia's governor, William Mann, Governor William Mann, Pennsylvania's Attorney General's office. So the court agreed. They accepted his guilty plea. They suspended his sentence, ordered him to pay all court costs, so another couple $100, plus the $1,500 he shelled out in civil damages. He was an attorney, of all things.
Interesting.
Make of that what you will.
So someone else wants to know, did you come across information on the filming of the reunion and the 1913 movie They Met at Gettysburg, which was the backdrop of the main story?
So there was, there was a movie about the Battle of Gettysburg that premiered in the spring of 1913. This big, sprawling, cast of thousands kind of epic. And I found newspaper coverage about the release of the movie. In digging around, I found that no copy of the movie exists, has survived. So there was a movie about the battle, but that just happened to come out that spring, ahead of the reunion. There were, I think there was probably newsreel footage shot at the reunion. I mean, there were lots of still photographers. There was newsreel footage shot, because actually in one of those photos of the crowd around the wall when they were attempting to reenact Pickett's charge and elbow their way through that crowd, you can see at least one film camera. But none of that has survived. The newsreel footage, none of that has survived. I looked. A DVD got released a number of years ago that is mainly footage from the 38 reunion. There's quite a bit of motion picture coverage, newsreel footage from the 1938 reunion, which was a much smaller, I think 12 or 1,300 men in their 90s at that point, when the Peace Memorial was finally dedicated by Franklin Roosevelt.
And then there's another question here from Nils. He's asking, could the silence when they were hearing the rebel yell, have been an expression of quiet indignation at the gall of the former Confederates to raise the rebel yell in an event
Sure,
that was supposed to commemorate reconciliation.
certainly could have been. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I came across a number of references to Union veterans who were not, as I think I mentioned before, not always fully pleased at the. I mean, I don't want to overstate that. The general tone and tenor of the event, I think, was one of genuine um, reconciliation
Hmm.
and good feeling among the veterans from both sides. Um, I think there were probably some Union veterans who felt it went a little too far at sometimes in terms of memory holding some of what the war was really about.
Hmm.
But the vast majority of the coverage I've read suggests that the men from the two sides, both sides, really did enjoy meeting one another. So they may have enjoyed less the big public events and the things where like the rebel yell would be given from by speakers, former Confederates on the stage, but the one-on-one meetings between the men who had fought one another, um, everything I've read suggests that those were really very genuine moments and very genuine moments of connection between them, because these were men who, no matter which side they had been on, they shared in common that experience of combat, and no one knew better than they did um, the courage it took to fight, whether you fought, by my side, on my side, or whether you fought on the other side, attacking, and that was something they had in common that other people back home, they couldn't share that with. They had seen things and known things that only this gradually dwindling pool of their fellow veterans, whichever side they had been on, understood and knew in the same way that they did. So I think there was one-on-one, there was a lot of genuine connection among the veterans. Um, as I say, some of the lost cause elements of the speechifying may have fallen a little flatter.
Hmm. And Dan wants to know, did you visit the battlefield before writing the book, and what insight did it give you?
Yeah, I did. I mean, because I did some research. There's a number of first-person accounts that are in the collections of the library at the Gettysburg National Military Park. So I did some research there, and I did some research at the Adams County Historical Society. So I made a couple of trips to Gettysburg and then several more to Harrisburg, where all the records of the planners are in the archives there, as well as hundreds of photos. But so my first research trip to Gettysburg, and it was the first time I had been there since, I think probably like almost everyone of my age. I visited Gettysburg when I was, 10, 12, whatever, with my parents. I had not been back to Gettysburg since then. And so I arrived out there for my first research trip, drove out from Ohio, got into town right around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It wasn't July, but it was June, and it was hot. And so before I checked into my hotel, I drove out to the battlefield and went to Cemetery Ridge and to the area around the High Water Mark Memorial. And I stood there in the heat and humidity of mid-afternoon and looked out for the first time since I had visited there as a boy, across that mile of open ground. And I felt the hairs on the back of my neck just stand up as I thought about what it meant to have come across all that open ground under artillery and rifle fire, and what it was like to be standing behind that wall waiting to receive them. And it just, I mean, I'm not really big on, thinking that believing in ghosts or the places, but I mean, there was a feeling in that spot that certainly there's it's hard to describe, but it was, you get this visceral feeling of what had happened there. And yeah, it was an inspiring way to begin what turned out to be a long research journey to do the research and write this book. And I think it was the right way to start too.
Well, thank you. And I think that's an excellent note to end on. So we really appreciate you taking the time tonight to share about your book. And the information's there on the screen if anyone wants to get a copy of it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight and for viewing. A special thank you to our members, because it is with your support that we get to continue at the American Civil War Museum doing the work of helping to explore, inspire, and promote the public's understanding of the Civil War. So thank you so much, John Hopkins. Excellent presentation.
Thank you for the invitation.
And with that, I'll say good night to everyone.